In 2001, researchers in England published a study about a family known only as the KE family. Almost half of the KE family suffers from a condition called speech-language disorder 1. They're unable to select and produce the fine movements of the lips and tongue that are necessary for speech, and they have difficulty learning written language as well. The researchers traced the syndrome to a gene on chromosome 7. This gene is called the FOXP2 gene, and it produces a transcription factor. Later studies showed that this transcription factor regulates the development of speech and language regions of the brain during embryogenesis. A year later, geneticists studying the FOXP2 gene in several mammal species made another discovery. The FOXP2 gene is highly conserved, so there's only a single amino acid difference between the protein in a mouse and a chimpanzee, and that's a hugely distant relationship there. However, there are two amino acid changes between the FOXP2 protein in the chimpanzee, which is unable to select and produce fine movements with the lips and tongue, and the protein in human beings. Evidence in the human genome suggests that the new mutations in the human FOXP2 allele were strongly favored by natural selection. The jury's still out, but it is possible that these two mutations laid the foundation for the human ability to use spoken language. There are a couple of different perspectives from which we're going to be looking at evolution in this part of the course. And I like to explain these through the analogy to driving your car. If you know a lot about cars, you can look under the hood and examine the mechanisms by which the car drives. You can look at the different parts, see how they interact, and maybe you can explain to somebody even exactly how the car changes, the way the motor works changes when you press down the accelerator. Most of us, though, aren't like that. What we do is we just think about the big picture. We're not paying attention to what happens under the hood. What we're interested in is, how does this car handle? Does it have good pickup? When I press the accelerator, does it accelerate quickly? Okay, these are two different points of view, but they're both valid. We want to know what's going on the big picture level, but sometimes we also want to know what's going on under the hood to make the big picture things happen. In the same way, we can look at evolution in two different ways. We can take the nuts and bolts view. We can look under the hood and ask, what is happening at the genetic level? How are DNA sequences changing? How are allele frequencies changing to change a population? So for example, this new mutant sequence of DNA might become more frequent in a population. That changes the way the whole population looks and behaves. Okay, those are the nuts and bolts of evolution. At the big picture, you can look at how the phenotypes of organisms change over time. So for example, if there is a particular phenotype that is really good for surviving and reproducing in a particular environment, then it might be that natural selection is going to weed out the individuals that are out here at the extremes. And what you're going to see is the range of variation in the species will narrow so that you get organisms that all look the same. Okay, without knowing exactly what's going on at the genetic level, you can look at these phenotypes and see what's going on. Over really long spans of time, you can even look at how novel characteristics evolved. And again, you don't have to know about the genetic details to think about the patterns that you see at this very big scale. What we're going to be doing in this class for the next few lectures is we're going to be looking at the nuts and the bolts. We're going to be looking at how genetic sequences change and then how allele frequencies change in a population, because that's really what evolution is. Evolution is a genetic change in organisms from one generation to the next. More specifically, it's a change in allele frequencies from generation to generation. And before we start talking about this, it might be useful for us to go over some definitions. A gene is a sequence of DNA that often codes for a product, a protein product that does something. So for example, there's an insect in England called the peppered moth. And in the genome of that insect, there is a gene for an enzyme that makes melanin. A locus is not quite the same as a gene. A gene is the actual sequence of DNA. The locus is the location on the chromosome where it's found. It's like an address. An allele is a particular form of a gene. So in the peppered moth, there are two alleles at this particular locus. In other words, there are two alleles for this particular gene. There is a functional allele that makes melanin. It's referred to as the big A allele. And there is a non-functional allele that does not perform the enzymatic reactions necessary to generate melanin. So melanin is this black pigment that you see over here on this moth. A trait is some aspect of an organism's phenotype, some aspect of how an organism looks or behaves. It can be influenced by one or more genes. And please remember, though, that the entire genotype affects the trait, not just one allele or the other one. It's the combination of the two alleles together determines the genetic component of a trait. So, for example, the trait in this case might be wing color. This moth over here has, the trait that this moth is showing is black wings. The trait that this moth is showing is gray, sort of peppered-looking wings. The reason that these are different is that this moth over here has at least one big A allele. This one has two little a alleles. And because the little a allele is not functional, this moth cannot make the melanin that makes the wings black. So a gene is the sequence of DNA that often codes for something functional. The locus is where that is found. Alleles are alternative forms of this sequence of DNA. And the trait is some aspect of the phenotype that arises because of the genotype that an organism has. One thing students get confused about is the term dominant when it applies to alleles. If you haven't taken genetics for a while, you might need to brush up on this. But this is something I see a lot of problems with, so I'm going to head that difficulty right off at the pass. In this system, A is the dominant allele. There are some things that dominant does mean, and some things that dominant doesn't mean. What it does mean is that the big A allele is the one that determines the phenotype in a heterozygote. So if you've got a big A, little a moth, that is a moth with only one of these melanin-making alleles, it looks like this. If it has two of these alleles, if it's a homozygote for the big A allele, it also looks like this. So the big A allele is completely dominant. It dominates the phenotype. And this allele over here, the one that doesn't make melanin, is recessive. This does not mean that the big A allele is favored by natural selection. That's not what dominant means. Dominant just refers to, when you've got a heterozygote, which allele determines the phenotype. It also does not mean that the big A allele is more common. We're not talking about superiority in terms of fitness. We're not talking about superiority in terms of numbers. We're just talking about which one can overpower the other one to generate the phenotype.